Deep in the woods, where maps fade and compasses fail, people vanish without a trace, leaving behind whispers of cryptids and cursed places. Tonight, Dreadscribe writes again. Before we begin, don't forget to like and subscribe for more chilling stories. Drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from and what time it is. I love seeing where everyone is tuning in from, and if there's a story you'd like me to cover next, I'd love to hear it too. I had been following an unmarked trail for hours, its thin thread weaving deeper into the Smoky Mountains than any map dared show. My GPS flickered uselessly, the compass needle trembling like it sensed something I couldn't. The forest grew older here, the trees thicker, their bark warped and furrowed like the skin of something ancient and alive. I was supposed to be mapping new routes for hikers, but the deeper I went, the less it felt like a place for people. It felt like stepping into a memory the earth itself had tried to forget. Just as the sun dipped below the ridge, I saw it, a faint orange glow pulsing through the trees ahead. It wasn't firelight, too steady, too deliberate, and yet it drew me forward the way a lighthouse calls to a ship lost in fog. My boots crunched over brittle leaves as I approached a clearing, and there it was, a sagging, rotted cabin leaning into itself like an exhausted old man. Every board looked ready to collapse. Every window was black and blind, except for the lantern hanging from the porch beam, burning with a soft, unwavering light. I stopped dead. No one had lived here for decades, maybe longer. Yet the lantern's glow was warm and alive, as if freshly lit moments ago. I climbed the creaking steps and examined it closely. No fuel, no wick, just an orb of flame suspended in glass, flickering without smoke, without sound. I felt a shiver crawl up my spine. It wasn't lighting the porch. It was watching it, like a single lidless eye refusing to blink. The air shifted, cooler and heavier, as if the forest were holding its breath. I stepped inside. The cabin's interior was skeletal, walls bowing inward, furniture devoured by time, a chimney yawning into nothing. But beneath the rot, there was an order to the decay. Symbols I didn't recognize were carved into the beams. A circle of stones, long cold, sat in the center of the floor. It wasn't a home. It was a ritual site. Locals had mentioned a trapper once, a man named Eli Carver who vanished here in 1892. Some said he froze in a blizzard, others that he went mad chasing something that wasn't an animal. They said he carried a lantern that never died, a light that guided him home no matter how far he wandered. I'd dismissed it as folklore. Now I wasn't so sure. I moved deeper inside, my flashlight cutting across warped walls and skeletal rafters. The beam landed on a trapdoor I hadn't noticed before, half concealed under a layer of dust and dead leaves. A faint hum rose from beneath it, not mechanical, not electrical, but alive, like the slow heartbeat of the earth itself. Against my better judgment, I lifted the hatch. A breath of damp, root-scented air spilled out, and a faint orange glow pulsed from the darkness below. It was the same light as the lantern, not reflected but connected as though the two shared the same breath. My pulse hammered. Something waited under there, and I had to see it. I started down the narrow steps, each creak louder than the last. The deeper I went, the stronger that hum became, rhythmic, patient, ancient. And when I reached the cellar floor and my eyes adjusted to the dim glow, I realized the light wasn't coming from any flame at all. It was growing. Roots veined across the dirt like arteries under skin, each thread pulsing with orange as if sap had learned to glow. They converged on a stone plinth where a second lantern rested, a cradle of roots holding a soft core of light. When I stepped closer, the glow swelled, then narrowed like a creature testing me. I touched a root. Warmth met my fingertip, not fire-hot, more like a forearm under a blanket. My mind grabbed for answers the way a drowning hand snatches air. Bioluminescent fungi through xylem, chemiluminescence and phloem. For a heartbeat the science held, then the hum matched my pulse. The light brightened with me, then took the lead. It wasn't responding. It was enrolling. Half buried under dust lay a brittle scrap of ledger paper, graphite stubborn as a scar. It keeps me safe so long as I keep it fed. Eli arrived in my head without sound. Winter-burned hands cupping a lantern that never needed oil. Safety like credit from the dark. A lighthouse that demanded shipwrecks. If he fed it, with what? And if it had chosen a keeper, had it just chosen another? I traced roots up the walls where they stitched through the foundation. The cabin wasn't failing. It was being worn, a skin over a body, a hermit crab in lumber, a cathedral using a house's throat. The porch lantern felt like a pupil, and this cellar, a brain behind it. A comfort tugged at me, the promise of belonging. But belonging offered by a thing that eats is a contract in vanishing ink. Why keep the light burning unless the forest remembered the ritual and needed it repeated? Dr. Hart once said forests memorize stress the way skin memorizes sun, scars as sentences. Maybe the glow was rehearsal, the land practicing how to knit itself closed. Maybe I wasn't inside a room at all. Maybe I was inside a scar. But what if a scar decides the cure is more wound? The hum deepened. A board popped overhead like a knuckle. Dust sifted down. Somewhere in the roots a breath began, wind through pipes, until even the circle of stones upstairs felt like a mouth waiting for soup. I whispered, "Not me." I stepped back, careful not to snap anything, and the glow receded, then surged, a tide reconsidering the shore. What would it do when I turned away? Outside, the trees leaned with a hush like robed jurors, and somewhere deeper an owl called once, then stopped, as if the verdict had already been read. I felt the mountain's attention slide over me, cool as water, patient as a hand on a fevered brow that night. When I reached the porch, the hanging lantern stared, bright as a widened eye. The compass needle on my chest strap spun like a coin deciding which face to show. I took one last look at the patient light that outlived oil, winters, and men, then turned into the trees. I walked until the glow dissolved between trunks like a secret swallowed. Reflective ending. Hours later, far from any trail, I woke certain the darkness in my room had narrowed around me, like a pupil answering a gaze. Maybe the forest didn't want me lost. Maybe it wanted me seen. The forest changed at the 43rd step. I didn't notice it at first, a subtle thinning of the wind, the hush of a distant stream falling abruptly still, but by the time I reached the clearing, it was undeniable. Sound itself had vanished. No chirping insects, no rustling leaves. Even my boots, which had crunched over deadfall all morning, made no noise as they pressed into the loam. It was as if I had crossed some invisible membrane and entered a vacuum carved into the heart of the Smoky Mountains. I'd been sent here by the Park Service to conduct a wildlife survey, a simple week-long job that was supposed to involve counting songbirds and setting up camera traps. But from the moment I stepped past that tree line, my instruments rebelled. My radio hissed and died. The acoustic sensors I'd carried for miles blinked and froze, registering a flat line where there should have been a riot of noise. Even my breathing seemed dampened, my heartbeat oddly distant, as though I were hearing it through someone else's chest. I walked deeper into the zone, each step swallowed by the silence. It wasn't just absence. It felt deliberate, as if the air itself had learned how to swallow noise before it was born. Every instinct screamed that I should turn back, yet curiosity pressed me forward like a hand between my shoulder blades. The deeper I ventured, the more the silence seemed to listen. It pressed closer, heavier, until it felt like a weight on my skin. Halfway through the clearing, I found the first clue, a rusted metal post, barely a foot above the soil, its surface scabbed with corrosion and something that looked like serial numbers. Nearby, half buried under moss and decades of leaf litter, was a square slab of concrete, the remains of a foundation long since claimed by the forest. I knelt to brush it clean, and as I did, faint lettering emerged beneath my fingertips. Do not enter. Project Echo. The name stirred something faint in memory. During the height of the Cold War, the military had tested acoustic suppression technology in remote wildernesses. Attempts to create zones where sound could not escape, where submarines and aircraft could pass undetected. Most had failed, or so the public record claimed. But standing there, surrounded by perfect silence, I wasn't so sure they'd abandoned the idea. Maybe they'd succeeded, and maybe something had stayed behind. I tried shouting just to hear my own voice. Nothing. My throat moved, muscles contracted, but the sound died an inch from my lips. It was like screaming underwater. Panic scratched at the edges of my chest. I turned in a slow circle, scanning the tree line. That's when I noticed it, a figure standing just beyond the clearing, half hidden behind a pine trunk. No details, no features, just an outline darker than the surrounding dark. I blinked, and it was gone. Heart hammering, I stumbled backward toward the tree line, desperate to break free of the silence. But as I moved, a deeper dread rooted in my chest. It wasn't that sound was absent here. It was that something owned it. And now I feared it. Running felt like the kind of motion prey makes, and the silence tasted like it preferred prey. I backed toward the trees, slow as lifting a teacup from a ledge. At the border of the clearing, my boot scraped stone, and for a heartbeat, I heard it. One dry whisper of grit. The instant of sound snapped shut, like a lid slamming on a jar. Whatever owned noise here had taken back its property. Beyond the pine trunks, a tangle of cables surfaced and dove like black snakes in leaf litter. I followed them to a concrete hatch veined with roots, its handle cold as the idea of winter. The hatch lifted with no squeal, only a pressure change, like opening a plane door at altitude. Stairs descended into a room that smelled of old batteries and rain. I told myself the only way out was through. The bunker was small. 2 desks, a row of obsolete monitors, a reel-to-reel recorder powdered with dust. On the wall, a corkboard of yellowed memos curled like dried leaves. Diagrams of wave interference, handwritten directives in hard slanted pen. Project Echo, field coupling protocol. Crossed out beneath it, containment. A logbook lay open, last entry smudged but legible. Phase 3, successful. Extraneous phonons removed within perimeter. Biological responses, inconsistent. I tested a recorder from my pack. Its red light came on, then dimmed, then brightened in a steady, predatory rhythm, as if syncing with a pulse not my own. A framed photograph lay face down on the floor. I turned it over and met 3 people in lab coats, smiling like pioneers at the edge of a map. Someone had written names: Lawson, Mirek, Reyes. Under Reyes, a second hand had added, stayed, a margin. Note beside the corkboard read, silence isn't absence, it's occupation. A flutter of movement crossed the doorway, silent as a nod. I felt the air lean inward. The curiosity that had pushed me here now felt like a contraband emotion. If the project stripped phonons from air, it didn't simply mute the world, it harvested the carriers of noise. Like a tide pool emptied by invisible moonlight, the clearing above had become a bowl where sound could not live. What happens, I wondered, when the tide decides to claim new shorelines? I climbed back up with the photograph inside my jacket, absurdly certain it needed a witness. At the threshold, the membrane pressed against me, and with a step I broke the seal. Sound crashed back, wind in needles, a crow's single hoarse remark, my own breath arriving like a letter long delayed. Relief came with an aftertaste of guilt. I turned to look once more, and saw a figure again, closer, a silhouette cut from the same fabric as the hush. I spoke once before thinking. My name, an apology, a question. The sounds drooped, heavy, and fell at my feet. I left the zone, but the silence kept a souvenir. That night in my cabin, the kettle steamed without a hiss, and my name on my voicemail played back as moving lips with no voice. The next morning I checked the photograph. Where 3 people had stood, there were only 2. Under an empty space, a new hand had printed a single word: listening. I first saw them on a morning so still it felt staged. The forest floor slick with dew, the air sharp enough to taste. My job that week was to chart fungal spread across a remote section of the Pacific Northwest. But what caught my eye wasn't a mushroom at all. It was a tree, ancient, hollow, its trunk split open like a mouth mid-breath. Inside, spirals had been carved into the wood, precise as fingerprints. Too deliberate to be weather, too intricate to be chance. At first I thought it was the work of humans, maybe old loggers, maybe some forgotten ritual. But then I noticed the others. Dozens of them scattered through the grove, each hollow, facing the same direction, each spiral aligned as if pointing toward something deeper in the forest. And in the half-light beneath the canopy, I could swear I saw shapes within them, faint, human-like contours embedded in the wood. Faces almost. Watching. I told myself it was pareidolia, the brain's lazy habit of finding faces where none existed. But the feeling didn't fade. It grew. By midday, the hairs on my neck were rising every time I turned my back. My camera traps caught nothing, yet I felt observed, not stalked, not hunted, but studied, like a specimen under glass. That night I met Dr. Leland, a local biologist who'd spent 30 years studying these forests. Over coffee in his cluttered cabin, I told him what I'd seen. He didn't laugh. "You found the hollow watchers," he said, his voice like gravel. "They're not trees anymore." "Not really. They're hosts." He explained a theory most dismissed as myth. A parasitic fungus, older than the forest itself, infects trees from the inside out. As it spreads, it hollows the trunk and alters growth patterns, sometimes even mimicking the shapes of predators to scare off herbivores. "But in certain conditions," Leland said, leaning closer, "it mimics us." I laughed nervously, but his eyes didn't waver. "You think you're looking at trees," he said, "but they're looking back." The next morning, I returned to the grove with new eyes. I pressed my ear to one hollow and heard a faint whispering hiss, like breath drawn through teeth. My thermal camera showed a faint heat signature pulsing within the wood, not animal, not fungal, but rhythmic, like a heartbeat. Whatever lived inside wasn't just growing. It was active. At dusk, I set a motion sensor at the grove's edge. At 3:12 a.m., it triggered. The footage showed nothing but darkness, until one hollow shifted. Not much, just a subtle tilt, a fraction of an inch, as if the tree had turned to look. I replayed it over and over, telling myself it was wind. But there was no wind that night. And then, the next morning, something impossible. On the inside wall of the largest hollow, the one I'd stood beside for hours, was a shape carved deep into the wood. My own face, unmistakable and staring back. That was the moment I stopped thinking I'd discovered something. It had discovered me. I stood frozen before that wooden likeness of myself, carved with uncanny precision, every contour of my cheek and slope of my brow captured as if by a sculptor's hand. But no hand had been here. I had been alone. The grooves were still damp, the edges raw, as if they had formed overnight. A smell rose from the hollow, wet and sweet, like decay laced with honey. I stepped back, my heartbeat sinking with the slow pulse of heat I'd seen on the thermal camera. Whatever this was, it wasn't just alive. It was aware. Leland didn't answer my calls. I drove to his cabin, but the door hung open and dust coated every surface, as though no one had lived there for years. On the desk, beneath a pile of field notes, I found a single page titled "Mimicry Phase, Stage 4." It described how the fungus first copies the shape of its environment, then its movement, and eventually its essence. Once human likeness is achieved, Leland had written, the subject becomes part of the colony's memory. My stomach twisted. Had the forest memorized me? I returned to the grove against every screaming instinct. Dusk painted the trunks gold, but inside the clearing the light seemed to bend and dim. The hollows no longer looked random. They formed a loose circle, each one angled slightly inward, all focused on a single point. In the center lay a mound of rich, damp soil, and protruding from it was something new, a small shoot, pale and trembling, with a bud that resembled a human hand. I don't remember kneeling, but suddenly I was there, fingers hovering inches from the shoot. Its skin-like surface quivered beneath the breeze, and when I exhaled, it turned toward me, unmistakably toward me, as if sensing the breath itself. I stumbled backward, but a hollow behind me groaned. The sound wasn't wood creaking, it was lungs filling. The air thickened. Faces I hadn't noticed before swam into view. Dozens, maybe hundreds, carved into the bark around me. Some were crude, others heartbreakingly detailed, frozen mid-scream or locked in quiet serenity. And among them, I recognized one more, Dr. Leland. His expression was calm, almost resigned, the bark pulling at his features like a second skin. My breath caught as a faint hiss rose from within the hollow. Not wind, not animals. Words, whispered syllables I couldn't quite parse. But one word, clear as a bell, cut through the noise. Stay. I fled, stumbling through the dark until the forest spat me out onto the logging road. Behind me, the grove watched in silence, the spirals in the wood catching the moonlight like 100 unblinking eyes. I didn't stop until the ranger station lights broke through the trees. Only then did I look back and swear the tree line had shifted closer. Now, weeks later, I still dream of that place. In the quiet moments before dawn, I feel the weight of unseen eyes on my skin. I keep checking the mirror, tracing the lines of my face, wondering if somewhere, deep in that forest, the trees are doing the same. Maybe the Hollow Watchers don't mimic us to deceive. Maybe they mimic us because, in their own ancient, patient way, they're trying to remember us.
Been there 2
Long
days
after
ago.
we've forgotten.
I was sure of it.
A narrow ribbon of dirt curling deeper into the Smoky Mountains, marked only by a faded wooden post and a pile of stacked stones. I had followed it for miles, mapping each turn, noting the way it dipped into a ravine and wound back out again. But now, standing at the same clearing with the same trees and the same light slanting through the canopy, there was nothing. Just unbroken forest floor where the trailhead should have been. I checked my GPS. Blank. The coordinates I'd saved were gone, replaced by an empty grid, as if the device itself refused to acknowledge the trail had ever existed. Even the cairn of stones had vanished. The only proof that I hadn't imagined it was the sketch I'd made in my field journal, a crude map showing a twisting path that now led nowhere. My pulse quickened. Forests change, trails fade, but they don't disappear overnight. Back at the ranger station, I asked around. None of the staff knew of a trail in that section. Old maps showed nothing. Even the veteran ranger, a man with 30 seasons behind him, looked at me like I was joking. "No trail there," he said flatly. "Never has been." The certainty in his voice chilled me. I'd walked that path. I'd marked trees along it. But somehow, in less than 48 hours, it had slipped from memory. Not just theirs, but reality's. I returned the next day, determined to prove it existed. This time I brought flags and chalk to mark every landmark. The forest felt heavier than before, like the air itself was denser. My compass spun lazily, refusing to hold north. And then, just beyond a familiar ridge, I saw it again. The trail, faint but real, a scar etched into the undergrowth as if waiting for me. It shouldn't have been there. Yet it was. I followed it. The deeper I went, the stranger it became. My watch glitched, minutes stuttering backward. The forest sounds, birdsong, wind, seemed to fade the farther I walked, replaced by an eerie, low-frequency hum, the kind you feel more than hear. My footsteps looped back on themselves. Trees I'd marked minutes earlier reappeared ahead of me, chalk still fresh. The trail wasn't leading me forward. It was folding space around me. Hours, or maybe minutes, later, I stumbled into a clearing I had never seen before. At its center stood a stone archway, weathered and half-buried, its surface etched with symbols that looked like constellations. Moss covered most of them, but one pattern was unmistakable. Orion's belt. Only it wasn't in the right place. The stars were inverted, mirrored, as if I were looking up from beneath the earth instead of from its surface. The hum deepened. The trees seemed to lean closer, and then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the trail behind me was gone. I wasn't lost. I was somewhere else. Panic clawed its way up my throat. The clearing was silent, not the soft, natural quiet of a forest, but the heavy, hollow stillness of a sealed chamber. I turned in slow circles, searching for the path I'd just walked, but there was no sign of it. No footprints, no bent grass, not even the faintest break in the tree line. It was as if the forest had swallowed my way out the moment I stepped through. The archway loomed at the clearing's center, its inverted constellations glowing faintly as the sky above dimmed, though the sun had not yet set. I approached, tracing a hand over the cold stone. It thrummed beneath my fingertips, a deep vibration like the resonance of a distant bell. This wasn't a ruin. It was active, alive in some way I couldn't comprehend. One symbol, a spiral intersected by 3 dots, repeated over and over like a heartbeat carved in stone. I crouched to examine the base and found something that made my skin prickle. Claw marks. Dozens of them, shallow but deliberate, all pointing inward toward the archway. Whatever had been here hadn't wanted to get out. It had wanted in. A flicker of movement caught my eye. Not from the trees, but from the arch itself. Light rippled across its interior like water stirred by an unseen breeze. I took a step back, heart hammering. The air around the stones thickened, and the hum I'd felt earlier rose in pitch until it became a physical pressure behind my eyes. The forest swayed as if in a slow exhale, and for a moment I swore the archway expanded and contracted, as if breathing. Every instinct screamed to run, but there was nowhere to run to. The trail was gone. My GPS was blank. My radio hissed with dead static. The only thing that existed in this place was me and the arch. So I did the one thing I probably shouldn't have. I stepped closer. The air shifted instantly. My vision warped, colors deepening into impossible shades. The trees on the horizon no longer stood still but seemed to stretch, lean, and coil like they were growing in reverse. The ground pulsed faintly under my boots, soft and unsteady, as though I were standing on the surface of something vast and sleeping. And then I saw it. Beyond the archway, faint and distant, was the outline of a trail. Not the one I'd entered on. This one was sharper, straighter, lined with flickering lights that moved like lanterns carried by invisible hands. I blinked, and it was gone. The hum ceased. The clearing stilled, and just like that, the archway was nothing more than weathered stone again. But the forest hadn't released me. It was still watching, still holding me in the palm of its ancient hand. My head spun with questions that had no answers. Had I glimpsed another trail, another place, or something older than either, a memory carved into the earth itself? I stumbled back toward where I thought the trail had been, desperate for any sign of the world I'd left. And there, half buried beneath a tangle of roots, I found something impossible. The same stacked cairn I'd built 2 days ago. Only now, instead of marking a trail in the woods, it stood at the edge of my driveway, 300 miles from the Smokies. I don't know how I got home. But some nights, when the wind is just right, I hear that low hum beneath my floorboards, patient, pulsing, waiting, as if the forest isn't finished with me yet. The first time I saw them, I thought it was a trick of the water. The creek was shallow, no more than a foot deep, its surface rippling lazily over smooth stones. But just beneath the current, 2 pinpricks of crimson hovered in the dark. They weren't reflections. They blinked. Once, twice. And then they followed me as I moved along the bank. I crouched, heart drumming against my ribs. The eyes didn't waver, didn't distort with the current, didn't scatter like fish when I tossed a pebble near them. They simply watched, unblinking now, with a patience that felt older than the forest itself. My camera dangled forgotten at my side. I wasn't ready to capture this. I wasn't sure I should. Later that night, back at camp, I told myself it was refraction, sunlight catching a submerged rock, my tired brain misfiring after a long day of tracking wildlife. But the feeling lingered, that sensation of being observed by something that understood I had noticed. The next morning I returned to the same spot, this time with a local photographer named Mason, who'd been documenting rare amphibians in the area. He laughed when I told him about the eyes, but humored me. And then he stopped laughing. "There," he whispered, pointing into the water. The eyes had returned. Same place, same slow blink, the same unnatural stillness. Mason leaned closer, snapping photo after photo. The eyes shifted slightly downstream, always at the same depth, always facing us. And then, as we stared, they began to rise. Water streamed off something pale and glistening as it broke the surface. Not an animal, not a fish, but something smooth and rounded, like the top of a skull. Mason stumbled back, nearly dropping his camera. The shape sank again before either of us could react, the crimson gaze vanishing beneath the current. Back in town, we showed the photos to anyone who would listen. Biologists, park rangers, even a university professor. They all said the same thing. Optical illusion, mud bubbles, light trick. But none of them could explain the blink. An elder from a nearby Cherokee community listened quietly as we described what we saw. When I mentioned the rising shape, his expression darkened. "Ayoka," he murmured, "the one who sees between." He explained that the stories spoke of a guardian spirit that lived in the water's skin, not above, not below, but in the between. It watched over those who respected the forest, and punished those who didn't. I wanted to dismiss it as folklore. But when we returned a third time, the creek was different. The water, once clear, had turned murky and dark, swirling with silt though no rain had fallen. And there were no birds, no frogs, nothing. The forest had gone silent. Then Mason gasped. Just upstream, where the water pooled deeper, a pair of crimson eyes opened again. Only this time there were 4. And they weren't staying still. They were moving toward us, slow and deliberate, like something that had been waiting for us to come back. And I realized, with a cold certainty that locked my breath in my chest, that we hadn't been watching it that first day. Water turned darker as the eyes advanced, spreading ripples that broke unnaturally against the current. Mason fumbled with his camera, snapping frantically, but the shutter seemed muffled, as though even sound was afraid to linger here. I stepped back, every instinct telling me to run, yet some deeper pull kept my feet rooted. The eyes swam closer until I realized with sick certainty they weren't under the water at all. They were in it, woven into the current like blood in veins. Mason muttered something I couldn't catch, his voice trembling, and then he bolted upstream, camera clutched tight. I followed, stumbling through reeds and slick stones, but the creek followed too, its surface rippling in unnatural rhythm, chasing us like a living thing. Branches whipped my face, and the forest pressed tighter around us. Every time I glanced down, the eyes were there. Sometimes 2, sometimes 4, sometimes dozens, flickering like embers beneath the black water. We stopped when the stream widened into a pool, its center so dark it looked bottomless. Mason leaned over the edge, his breath ragged. He raised his camera one last time, flash ready. The instant it fired, a shape rose. Not fish, not human. Something pale, smooth, boneless, unfurling with an elegance that felt wrong. For a split second, the lens caught it. An elongated head with hollows where a face should be. And within those hollows, eyes that glowed like open wounds. The flash died, and the pool erupted. Water surged upward in a violent arc, drenching us both. I scrambled backward, choking on mud and weeds. Mason screamed. Then silence. The pool stilled as quickly as it had risen, its surface glassy once more. He was gone. Camera, backpack, everything. The water rippled once as if swallowing laughter. I staggered to the bank, shaking, waiting for Mason to surface. He didn't. Only the eyes remained, dozens now, orbiting slowly in the depths. They blinked in unison, patient, deliberate, as though cataloging my every breath. I wanted to scream, to call his name, but the weight of the forest pressed down on me, a warning heavy as stone. Don't. I ran until my legs buckled, collapsing on the far side of the ridge. The creek still whispered behind me, trickling with deceptive gentleness, as though nothing had happened. No one believed my account when I stumbled back into town at dawn. They said Mason must have fallen, drowned, lost to an undertow. But I know undertows don't watch, they don't wait. Weeks later, the photos surfaced. His camera was found downstream, mud-caked but intact. Most of the shots were blurred, but one image remained sharp. A pale shape rising from black water, its eyes burning crimson through the flash. The archivist who processed the photos said something odd, that the negatives themselves seemed to warp, as if resisting duplication. Now, whenever I pass a stream, I can't help but glance down, and sometimes when the water is still and the light is low, I see them again, waiting. The elders had called it a guardian, but guardians protect. These eyes do not guard, they claim. And I can't shake the feeling that Mason wasn't the first, and won't be the last. It began with a pulse, faint, almost imperceptible, a single blip that repeated every 13 minutes on the spectrogram of our remote forest research station. At first, we thought it was equipment malfunction, some stray noise from a nearby transmitter bleeding into our frequency, but the signal persisted, steady as a heartbeat. It wasn't random either. Each burst followed a precise timing pattern, separated by intervals too intentional to be nature, too chaotic to be man-made. Something was speaking, and it was coming from deep within the pines. I was part of a small team cataloging tree growth and soil chemistry in one of the most untouched groves left in the region. No towers, no cell service, no power lines. For miles in every direction, silence, forest, and old earth. Yet our receivers picked up the pulse loud and clear. It was low frequency, buried deep in the electromagnetic spectrum, almost like a whisper beneath static. And stranger still, it wasn't transmitting outward. It was radiating upward, as though the forest itself were trying to speak to the sky. We triangulated the source over several days, dragging portable antennas and oscilloscopes through terrain that grew more primal the farther we went. Eventually, all signals converged on a dense grove of ancient pines, trees so massive and tightly clustered they blocked out the sky. The ground there was different too, softer, richer, as if something below was feeding the roots. Our instruments screamed with interference the moment we stepped inside. At the grove's center, half buried in soil and tangled roots, was metal. Twisted, corroded, and far older than any human debris had a right to be. It wasn't a transmitter, at least not one we recognized. Its surface was pitted and etched with markings we couldn't decipher, geometric but alien in their logic. One corner of the object curved upward in a way that reminded me of heat shielding on old spacecraft. But this thing had been here far longer than spaceflight existed. Could be a satellite fragment, one of the texts said. Cold War era, maybe. But that didn't explain the growth around it. Pine roots coiled through its seams, bark fused to metal as if the forest had adopted the object into itself. A faint hum resonated from within, the same 13-minute pulse we'd detected back at the station. It wasn't broadcasting. It was alive, or something close to it. We set up instruments overnight, hoping to record more data. But something happened after sunset. The pulse changed. The timing shifted by a fraction of a second, then another, forming patterns that looked almost like code. My watch, Sync 2, an atomic clock, began to drift, 13 minutes ahead by midnight. And in the stillness of the grove, I felt a pressure in the air, the uncanny sense that something beneath the soil was aware of us. At 02:13, the pulse stopped completely, and in the silence that followed, every tree in that grove began to vibrate. Not with wind, the air was dead still, but with something deeper, a resonance I felt in my teeth and bones. It was as if the forest was listening and answering. And then, buried in that vibration, came a new signal. Not a pulse, a voice. The voice, if it could be called that, was faint, woven into the vibration itself rather than transmitted through air. It wasn't speech I could understand, more like tonal shifts layered with pauses, the cadence of language without the words. My colleagues stared at their instruments, disbelief etched across their faces. The waveform on our oscilloscope was no longer a neat spike every 13 minutes. It was complex, structured, like something talking back. We stayed rooted in that grove until dawn. Every attempt to record the signal failed. Our drives corrupted, batteries drained. Even our backup analog gear produced nothing but static. Yet we could feel the pulse in our bones, hear the not voice in the marrow of our teeth. And strangest of all, the forest moved with it. The pines swayed in perfect sync despite the still air, as though responding to a conductor's baton only they could see. On the third night, I returned alone. The team had voted to suspend operations until we could bring in more equipment, but curiosity gnawed at me like a persistent insect. I needed to know if the pulse would return, and what it might become without a crowd listening. The grove greeted me with a hush, but not emptiness. A charged, waiting silence like a held breath. I placed my hand on the twisted metal and felt the rhythm surge up through the roots. It wasn't random. It was deliberate. A greeting. A test. I realized with a chill that the signal wasn't broadcasting into space at all. It was broadcasting downward. I knelt to brush away soil near the metal's edge and froze. Etched into the surface beneath layers of rust and root were not just markings, but coordinates, and they weren't terrestrial. They pointed far beyond Earth, to a region near Tau Ceti, light years away. My breath caught. The implications roared in my head. Had something from there landed here? Or worse, was this object a receiver, planted to listen for something coming? The forest shifted. The vibration deepened, and then, for the first time, the signal spoke in a way I understood. Not words, but an image carved directly into my mind. A spire of light descending through blackness. A seed plunging into soil, roots burrowing outward, merging with the earth, drinking deep. And beneath it all, the undeniable impression of time. Not decades, centuries. The hum slowed. My watch jumped backward 13 minutes, then forward again, syncing perfectly with the pulse. I stumbled back from the object, breathless. I wasn't looking at a crash site. This wasn't wreckage. It was planted here, deliberately, patiently, and the forest had grown around it like flesh over bone. By the time I left the grove, dawn was breaking, painting the pines in thin ribbons of gold. The signal had stopped again, as though it had said what it came to say. Yet every 13 minutes since, no matter where I am, in the city, in my home, even deep underground, my watch jumps forward, and a faint pressure blooms behind my eyes. I once believed the forest was listening to something. Now I suspect it's waiting. And whatever it's waiting for, the road was might already be awake beneath a narrow scar threading through the undergrowth, half swallowed by decades of moss and time. We were searching for a missing hiker, a man last seen heading toward an abandoned logging road no one had used in 50 years. By dusk we found it, not the man, but a cabin. Its roof sagged inward, shingles scattered like broken teeth across the dirt. The door was gone, the windows shattered. It looked more skeleton than shelter, the kind of ruin you photograph once before moving on. Yet something about it unsettled me. The trees leaned back as if pushed away, leaving a perfect clearing around the structure. The air was unnaturally still, and though the forest behind us rang with insects, this place was mute. We marked it on our maps, set up camp a mile away, and agreed to investigate properly in daylight. When we returned the next morning, the cabin had changed. Not collapsed further, rebuilt, whole again. Its roof straight, its chimney breathing faint ribbons of smoke. A lantern glowed faintly behind the window, though the night before there had been only shards of glass. My teammate cursed under his breath, muttering about squatters or some cruel prank. But the structure had shifted in ways that defied explanation. Boards that had been rotted through were now firm and smooth, nails gleaming with new iron. Even the door had returned, hanging straight and proud on hinges that whispered softly as the breeze touched them. We circled it cautiously, searching for tracks, but the ground was pristine. No footprints, no tire marks, nothing but pine needles and the faint smell of resin. I pressed my hand against the wall, warm, not sun-warmed, living warm, as though the wood itself had blood running through it. I pulled away quickly, heart hammering. Inside, the transformation was worse. The floorboards creaked, but they held. Furniture stood where there had been only dust piles, a table, 2 chairs, a wood stove faintly ticking as though it had just been lit. Yet there were no dishes, no blankets, no tools, no evidence of a human life. It was as if the cabin had remembered what it once was and rebuilt itself from memory, but left out the people. My flashlight cut across the walls, and that's when I noticed it. The grain of the wood wasn't random. It was patterned. Concentric circles, spirals, almost like fingerprints pressed into the lumber. The design repeated, pulsing faintly with the rhythm of breath. "Do you feel that?" my teammate whispered. And I did. A subtle vibration running through the soles of my boots. A hum that wasn't sound but sensation, the floor quivering like the skin of something restless beneath. We left in a hurry, more shaken than we admitted. That night at camp I dreamed of the cabin, but in my dream it wasn't a building. It was a body, walls folding like ribs, the chimney rising like a throat, the windows blinking like eyes, and in the dream it leaned toward me, whispering without words, "Come back." When I woke, the smell of smoke lingered in my tent, though our fire had burned out hours ago. We returned the following afternoon, drawn by duty and dread in equal measure. The clearing was as silent as before, the trees pulled back like a crowd avoiding contact. Only this time the cabin looked different again. Its boards were cleaner, its edges sharper. The chimney no longer sagged but stretched higher, almost proud, sending up a faint spiral of smoke that smelled not of wood but of something sweeter, like resin boiled into syrup. I forced myself inside first. The hum was stronger now, a steady vibration thrumming through the walls as if every plank held a trapped heartbeat. On the table lay a single object, a cup carved from the same wood as the cabin itself, smooth and seamless, warm to the touch. I set it down quickly, unsettled by the thought that the house had grown it for me. My partner found the cellar door behind the wood stove. It hadn't been there yesterday. Its hinges looked fresh forged, its handle polished, inviting. Against every survival instinct, we pulled it open. The smell hit us first. Damp earth, sap, and something faintly metallic like iron left in rain. The steps creaked beneath our boots, but not in decay. It was more like the creak of tendons stretching, of something adapting under pressure. The cellar was small and unfinished, the dirt walls lined with thick root-like tendrils that pulsed faintly with light. They spread into the beams overhead, threading the cabin's bones like veins. One tendril split open as I watched, releasing a trickle of amber fluid that steamed when it hit the floor. My partner muttered that it looked like blood, and I couldn't disagree. Pinned against one wall was a photograph, brittle and curling at the edges. It showed a family of 4 standing proudly before the same cabin. But the date in the corner read 1924. Local records whispered of a family who had vanished that winter, never recovered. As I stared at their smiling faces, a slow horror bloomed in my gut. The cabin hadn't outlived them. It had kept them. Something shifted above us. A groan, deep and guttural, rolled through the floorboards. Dust rained from the beams. The roots flexed, tightening, as if the cabin sensed intruders within its marrow. We bolted for the stairs. The door slammed behind us with a force that rattled my bones, though no hand touched it. The lanterns flared brighter, their glow no longer warm, but suffocating, thick as honey. We ran. Out the door, across the clearing, not stopping until the forest swallowed the sight of that impossible house. My lungs burned, my legs trembled, but I didn't dare look back. Still, in the corner of my vision, I thought I saw the cabin tilt, just slightly, as if it were leaning forward to watch us go. That night, sleep brought no peace. I dreamed again of walls folding like ribs, of windows blinking with hunger. Only this time, when the house whispered, "Come back," it wasn't in the dream. Days later, reviewing satellite footage for mapping, I froze. Where my home should have been, the image showed a cabin. Whole, perfect smoke rising from its chimney. And when I zoomed closer, I saw myself standing at the door, smiling. We were 3 miles off any marked path when we found it, a clearing scattered with bones. At first I thought they'd been dragged there by predators, the way wolves sometimes cache kills. But the longer I stared, the less sense it made. Hundreds of bones, animal and human alike, were arranged in perfect concentric circles, each ring larger than the last, spreading outward like ripples frozen in time. Every bone was stripped clean, gleaming white against the dark soil, as if polished by unseen hands. The forest around us held its breath. No birds, no insects, not even wind through the branches. Just the brittle crunch of my boots as I stepped closer. I knelt to examine one of the skulls. Deer, I thought at first, until I noticed the jaw was wrong, stretched wider, teeth sharpened beyond any natural shape. My stomach turned. These weren't just bones. They had been changed. The ranger with me muttered that he wanted to leave, but curiosity tugged at me, irresistible. Each circle of bones was separated by precise gaps, like someone had measured them. At the center lay a shallow depression in the earth, no larger than a campfire pit. Its soil was blackened, rich, and faintly warm. I pressed my palm against it and recoiled instantly. It pulsed, like a heart beating underground. That night I spoke with an archaeologist I knew at the university. Over the phone I described what we'd found. He grew quiet, then told me of ancient rituals practiced by forgotten cultures, offerings to the land itself. Not sacrifices to gods, but to the earth. He said the circles were feeding patterns, meant to replenish something beneath the soil. If you disturb it, he warned, you may not like what wakes. I laughed it off, but unease gnawed at me, because even as we spoke, I could still feel the echo of that pulse in my palm. The next morning, I returned alone. The clearing hadn't changed, but it felt different. The bones seemed fresher, as if more had been added overnight. And in the soft dirt near the edge of the circles, I saw prints. Not animal, not human. 4 elongated depressions, symmetrical, claw-like, pressed deep into the soil. They led into the trees, and then vanished. I should have left. I should have turned back. But I stepped into the center instead. My breath came ragged, my chest tight, as though the air itself resisted me. I crouched by the pit, brushing away a layer of ash. Beneath it I found more bones, newer ones. Human femurs stacked neatly, their marrow hollowed clean. The ground beneath them pulsed again, stronger this time, and for a brief second I thought I heard a sound. Not from above, from below. A low rhythmic movement, something shifting in its sleep, and then came the circling. Soft at first, like branches swaying in windless air. I stood, heart racing, as shadows gathered around the outermost ring. Shapes, many of them. Moving in sync, pacing, the crunch of unseen steps tracing the circles. Only there was nothing there to cast them, and with every pass, the bones seemed to rattle just slightly, as if they were steady my shaking hands. The clearing remained empty, yet the circling continued, faint indentations forming in the soil where no feet walked, the bones vibrating with each invisible pass. It felt ritualistic, purposeful, as though something was pacing the perimeter, marking its claim. Then, as suddenly as it began, the motion stopped. The silence that followed was worse, a pressure in my ears like the forest itself was leaning closer to listen. The ground beneath my boots shifted. Just slightly, a soft give, like wet clay. I crouched and pressed my palm against the center again. This time the pulse wasn't faint. It was steady, powerful, unmistakably alive. And then I heard it. A hollow exhale rising from beneath the soil, followed by another. Breathing. Something beneath the clearing was breathing. I stumbled backward, my mind scrambling for logic. Gases escaping decomposing matter, seismic pressure. My rational brain clung to science like a lifeline. But the deeper part of me, the part that still believed in things older and hungrier than science, knew better. This was no geological event. This was a heartbeat, a sleeping thing just below the surface, fed by the bones arranged above it. I turned to leave, but movement caught my eye. On the far edge of the clearing, one of the circles had shifted. A deer skull had turned inward, its empty sockets now staring at the pit. Then another shifted, and another. One by one, the bones twisted to face the center, aligning like a congregation bowing in prayer. My breath hitched. I wasn't supposed to see this. Whatever this was, it wasn't meant for human eyes. The earth groaned, a deep, resonant sound that rolled through the clearing like thunder trapped underground. Cracks spidered outward from the central pit, dark soil splitting open to reveal more bone beneath. They weren't placed there. They grew there, emerging like roots pushing through loam. I backed away slowly, heart pounding in my throat. And then the whispering began. It wasn't a sound, not exactly. More like the echo of thought pressing against my mind. Fragments, hunger, return, feed. I clamped my hands over my ears, but it didn't stop. The clearing was inside me now, pushing and pulling with a rhythm older than language. I turned and ran. I didn't stop until I reached the truck, lungs burning, sweat freezing on my skin. I looked back once, just once, and wished I hadn't. The clearing was gone. No bones, no circles, no pit. Just unbroken forest floor stretching where the ritual site had been. As if the forest had stitched itself closed to hide the wound. Days later, when search teams combed the area for the missing hiker, they found nothing. No bones, no sign of him. No trace of the clearing I'd stood in. They told me I must have wandered off trail, mistaken one hollow for another. But I know what I saw. Sometimes late at night, I feel a faint pulse beneath my feet, a rhythmic tremor deep in the earth. And in those moments I think of that clearing, and of the thing beneath it, still dreaming, still hungry, waiting for the next offering to fall into its open mouth. It started as a whisper on the Ranger Channel, a missing hiker, last seen near a disused section of the Appalachian Trail. Nothing unusual, not at first. But then came the second report, and the third. Each the same, vanished without trace, gear left behind, no signs of struggle. The only common thread was geography. All of them disappeared near mile marker 217, a stretch of trail even seasoned rangers avoided after dark. Locals called it Reverse Hollow. I used to laugh at the name. I don't laugh anymore. I was sent to investigate after the fifth disappearance. The woods there were older, darker, the canopy knitted so tight it turned midday into dusk. My boots sank deep into damp loam as I combed the trail, calling out the missing hiker's name. Nothing answered, not even birds. The silence here wasn't absence. It was avoidance. Even the forest didn't want to speak. That's when I saw it. Movement through the trees, 20 yards ahead. A human shape slipping between the trunks. My breath caught. It was walking backward. Not stumbling or retreating. Walking, steady and deliberate. Feet moving heel first through the leaves. Head tilted slightly as though listening to something I couldn't hear. And its limbs. God, its limbs bent the wrong way. Elbows hinged too far back. Knees reversing mid-step. It was like watching anatomy unlearn itself. I shouted, but the figure didn't react. It just kept gliding backward deeper into the forest until it vanished behind a ridge. Every instinct screamed to leave, but I followed. I had to know. The deeper I went, the stranger it became. My compass spun aimlessly, GPS refused to lock, and the trail behind me, the one I had walked a dozen times, was gone. Only trees, endless and unfamiliar. At one point I swore I heard footsteps behind me, crunching out of sync with mine. I turned. Nothing. Then, as the sun bled orange through the branches, I saw the figure again. Closer this time. Just beyond a grove of cedar, its head still turned slightly as though listening to the wind. The forest seemed to lean toward it. Shadows pooled around its feet, bending in unnatural directions. I raised my flashlight and the beam caught its face, or where a face should have been. There were no features. Just smooth, pale skin stretched taut over bone, and in the faint glow I saw my reflection moving backward within it. My heart nearly stopped. I stumbled away, tripping over roots, branches clawing at my jacket. I didn't stop until I burst out onto a different section of trail entirely, one I'd never seen. My radio crackled back to life with a burst of static. And then a voice I didn't recognize whispered, "Not your shadow." That night I filed my report, leaving out the details no one would believe. But I can't shake the image. A figure that walks against the flow of time, bending the forest around it. And as I drifted to sleep, I saw something that turned my blood cold. On the wall of my cabin, cast by the lantern's glow, my shadow was moving. But I wasn't. I woke gasping, drenched in sweat, my eyes darting to the wall where the shadow had moved. Nothing. Just the steady flicker of lantern light stretching my shape across the wood. I told myself it was a dream. Stress, exhaustion, the forest playing tricks on me. But as I swung my legs off the cot, I noticed something that made my skin crawl. The shadow's head turned after mine did, just a fraction too late. A delay, like a puppet tugged by a slow hand. I left before dawn, determined to prove to myself that what I'd seen in those woods had a rational explanation. A trick of the light, a misfiring memory, anything but the truth that gnawed at me. The trail near mile marker 217 was empty again, but the silence was worse this time. Not heavy, but expectant, as if the forest knew I had returned. The morning fog clung to the ground in long, finger-like coils, and every few steps, I swore I heard something breathing behind me. I set up trail cameras along the path, angled toward the ridge where I'd seen the backward walker vanish. By dusk, the air had turned icy still. I sat alone beneath the cedar grove, every muscle tense, listening. And then I heard it. A slow, deliberate shuffle, leaves crunching in reverse rhythm. My pulse thundered as the figure emerged from the mist again, gliding backward, joints bending like marionette strings pulled too tight. I stayed frozen, afraid that if I moved, it would notice me. But it already had. Mid-step, it stopped and turned its head. Not forward, but fully around, vertebrae twisting with a wet crack until its faceless front faced me. My breath caught. Its body kept facing away, but its head had rotated a full 180 degrees. No eyes, no mouth, just pale, stretched skin. And within that blankness, I saw my own outline mirroring every motion I made. The cameras clicked silently. The figure cocked its head, and for the briefest moment it felt like I was the one being filmed. Then, slowly, it began to walk again, backward, into the trees, and with each step, my body felt heavier, as though gravity itself was shifting. I stumbled forward and looked down. My boots were leaving prints that led behind me. My arm swung in reverse. My breath came out before I inhaled. Panic broke whatever hold it had. I turned and ran, tearing through the brush until I reached my truck, my lungs burning. I didn't stop until I hit pavement and cell service. But when I reviewed the footage later, my blood ran cold. The figure was there, yes, jerking backward, bending wrong. But at the 10-minute mark, something changed. A second shape appeared, stepping forward in sync with it. It was me. My posture, my gait, my movements but reversed. And as the figure faded into the trees, my mirrored self turned to the camera, lifted a hand, and waved. I avoid mile marker 217 now, but I've stopped trusting mirrors too. Some nights I catch my reflection taking a step before I do. And when I turn off the lights, my shadow lingers just a heartbeat too long, still walking backwards behind me. Weeks had passed since my last encounter, but the forest was still with me, lingering like the taste of iron and water. Every trail I walked, every grove I visited, carried echoes of what I had seen before. A cabin where no cabin should be, a trailhead that vanished overnight, eyes in the water that followed me home. They weren't just memories. They were returns. It began subtly. A tree on my morning walk bore the same spiral markings I'd once seen deep in the Pacific Northwest. The next day, a rusted post appeared on the edge of town, half swallowed by ivy, with the words Project Echo just barely visible. These were fragments of stories I had lived but displaced, rearranged, like a deck of cards shuffled by unseen hands. The forest was leaking into places it didn't belong, stitching its memories into my world. I drove back into the mountains, desperate for answers. The deeper I went, the more the land seemed to change beneath me. The cabin where I'd first seen the endless lantern was gone, consumed entirely by overgrowth, yet the smell of smoke still lingered in the air. The clearing where bones had formed perfect circles was empty. No bones, no pit, only an unnatural richness to the soil that pulsed faintly when I touched it. Each site I revisited had dissolved into something untraceable, as if the forest were erasing evidence while leaving me with the weight of recollection. At dusk, I met with a mycologist who had studied fungal communication networks. She explained how forests store trauma. Chemical scars pass through roots and soil, trees sharing warnings long after the danger has passed. The woods remember, she said. They don't forget. They just rewrite. Her words landed heavier than she intended. Because what if these places weren't just remembering danger? What if they were remembering me? That night I camped at the edge of an unmarked grove. The air was damp, thick with the musk of pine needles. Sleep came uneasily, broken by dreams that felt less like imagination and more like recollection. I saw the backward figure pacing in silence, the hollow trees bending closer, the cabin's ribs folding inward. They weren't just images. They were records, etched into the land, replayed through me. When I woke, the grove had shifted. The trees stood closer together, tighter as though they had crept inward overnight. In the center of the clearing, carved freshly into bark, was my name. Letters ragged, raw but unmistakable. I touched the grooves, and the wood was warm. The forest wasn't just remembering itself anymore. It was remembering me. And as I stood there, hand pressed to the tree, I couldn't escape the thought that memory is never passive. Memory shapes, rewrites, and retells. If the forest had taken me into its story, it might not ever let me go. When the wind stirred the branches, it didn't sound like rustling. It sounded like whispering, and it was whispering in my voice. I left that grove before dawn, but the whisper followed me. It threaded itself through the sound of the wind, hid beneath the crunch of leaves beneath my boots, and hummed faintly through the static of my radio. No matter how far I walked, I couldn't shake the feeling that the forest wasn't behind me anymore. It was inside me. And the further I went, the more the world outside those trees began to bend. Back in town, strange details surfaced. A single pine needle on my kitchen table, though none grew for miles. Muddy footprints appearing overnight across the floor. Too small to be mine, too irregular to be human. My reflection in the hallway mirror flickered, and for the briefest moment I swore the trees behind me were moving. And then came the smell. Damp soil and wood rot drifting through the vents of a house nowhere near the woods. The forest was no longer confined to geography. It was rewriting the map around me. Desperate, I returned one final time. This time I brought instruments, soil sensors, spectrometers, EMF readers. I wanted data, something concrete to anchor myself to, but the forest rejected them. The readings warped, fluctuating wildly, as if the land was rewriting even the laws that governed it. Roots shifted beneath my feet, subtly but undeniably, tracing looping patterns in the soil. At first they seemed random until I realized they weren't patterns at all. They were paths, trails leading inward, deeper, toward a place I had never been. I followed them. The air thickened the deeper I walked, saturated with the scent of moss and something older, like the breath of buried stone. The trees grew impossibly tall here, their trunks gnarled and scarred with carvings I didn't recognize. Some bore symbols from Project Echo, others mirrored the spirals of the Hollow Watchers. One even held the faint outline of my own face, etched so delicately it looked grown rather than carved. The trail ended at a hollow I'd never seen before, an enormous ring of roots forming a natural amphitheater. At its center stood a single tree, massive and alone, its bark blackened and cracked like the surface of a dying star. And hanging from one low branch was a lantern. The lantern, still burning, still watching. The hum returned, deep and patient, resonating through the ground and into my chest. And then faintly the carvings began to move, not grow, shift, rearranging themselves like a story being rewritten. Cabin, signal, bones, trail, eyes, all of them forming a sequence that ended with a single final mark, a human silhouette. My silhouette, and in that moment I understood. The forest wasn't cataloging the things that happened here. It was learning from them, folding them into itself, expanding its memory with every encounter. I wasn't an observer. I was a chapter, one that would live here long after my heartbeat faded. As I left the grove, the wind carried a whisper that wasn't mine but knew my name. I once believed the forest was a place. Now I know it's a story, one that remembers everything it touches and never lets go. Subscribe, if you dare.